Welcome to lesson 1.2. We'll continue talking about soil formation. However, this time we'll concentrate on the soil organic matter component of soil and how the soil food web interacts with the soil organic matter component. Then how that actually creates soil structure and how this complex we call soil and the soil ecological community that it supports, how that actually supports above ground ecological plant succession. Okay, so let's jump into lesson 1.2.
So the other important thing besides the mineral component is the soil organic matter. It is one of the most important national resources, and its unwise exploitation has been devastating, and it must be given its proper rank in any conservation policy. Albrecht has said this in 1938, and this coincided with the Dust Bowl, where America suffered Great Depression due to their agricultural system not being able to sustain the population because of how much loss there was through tillage, overgrazing. All of these things destroyed soil so much that scientists were like, well, now we've got to look at what happened and what is it that we lost and why. So this book was called Loss of Soil Organic Matter and Its Restoration, Soil and Man, USDA Yearbook of Agriculture. But possibly is online somewhere. We can look at it and read about what happened. This is an example of what happens in Australia in drought, where the country has been so overgrazed so severely that it's become desert. And the cows are dying in large numbers, farmers are going broke, and these are trucks trucking in from the landscape that still has grass and actually delivering that to farmers so they can go home and feed their cattle, which is completely wasteful because what happens is it's just being mined from other areas, all that organic matter that should be staying put just to feed cows, when really the problem is how we treat the soil by grazing in the first place. So it's a very sad situation, and it's definitely something we should avoid if we want to sustain food production, because all this land, even though it's dry to start with, all the minerals are there for the microbiology to be present, to be feeding plants and growing trees. So I think this is where we need to be heading. So what is this soil organic matter? So it is plant inputs dominated by microbial molecules. It's accumulated decaying plant debris, dissolved or particulate. Dissolved just means leaf litter, leachates, root exudates, and rhizodeposits, so whatever the plant puts out through its root system. Particulate is when it's senesced, dead shoots and root litter basically in the soil, and it's the substrate that provides energy and nutrients for decomposer community bacteria and fungi. So really, it's the bacteria and fungi that feed on this organic matter and require this in addition to just the photosynthesized plant material that comes in a form of simple sugars that are given to the microorganisms. It is definitely a product of microbial decomposition, and as the microbes die, they create necromass, which is 30% of organic matter in temperate forests that is actually made by the dead cells. So that organic matter has 30% of dead microbial cells, and in grasslands it's 62%, and that's soil organic carbon that has this huge amount of organic carbon taken up by these microbes. It just shows you the sheer enormity of these microbes that should be present in these ecosystems. Soil organic matter contains 58% carbon, and we call it SOC, soil organic carbon. I use a lot of acronyms just because it's easier to not have to write too much. It's just lovely to have a shorter way to explain things to you guys rather than writing all of these long words. So a lot of the times there'll be acronyms, and oftentimes they're just explained, or I'll say them in the right way. You just got to catch it in the right time. So soil organic carbon, SOC, in 100 centimeter topsoil is about 50% of terrestrial carbon pool. And the decomposition residues, as the microbes churn this organic matter, decreases their energy content, but it increases their chemical reactivity with mineral matrix, and that means that they get stuck onto the minerals, and it actually sequesters carbon into the soil and makes it stay there for longer periods of time, as long as there's no disturbance. So soil organic matter can be divided into these different groups. So photosynthetic exudates from the plant, coming straight from the plant as sugars and amino acids, but mostly the sugar and carbohydrate component is the organic matter. then plants and microbial products at various stages of the decomposition. So this is like our fresh residues being decomposed. There's also humic substances. So once that decomposition churns down to only the humic substances near or end of decomposition, I'll describe these a little bit more later, and that eventually creates 65% of our organic matter in the soil. And these humic substances have high molecular weight and are yellow to black in substance formed by secondary synthesis reactions, and I'll describe that a little bit more in a second. And there's really no morphological resemblance to original material. It's just dark, beautiful soil that's made by this. Living organisms only actually make up 10% of organic matter. The fresh residues also just make up 10%, but it's these two that then create this. So there's resistant organic matter, and that's probably just stuff that can no longer be decomposed, so that becomes part of this humus, but on a more recalcitrant or non-degradable section of that. But these two components actually feed all of this, so that's important to remember. And the way it happens is that plants feed the microbes carbon exudates as carbon dioxide that we breathe out goes into the plant, and then it is demanded, and just by sheer gravitational pull, and the plant actually does work on expressing these exudates to its roots, and majority of that carbon is actually held up in the roots and the microorganisms that grow on the roots, and those are mycorrhizal fungi, which are the partner fungi on the roots. Myco means mushroom or fungus, and rhizal means root, and they grow symbiotically, and they basically extend the root biomass into the soil. But then also the plant drops its limbs, and it has to be decomposed by the decomposer fungi, and that then releases the nutrients from that decomposition. So the plant essentially then feeds itself on its already decomposed matter as well, and takes that back up. So all the nutrients abound in these organic places, and carbon gets sequestered, but also at the same time as it gets decomposed, all the minerals come off and get fed back to the plant. So the plant literally is eating itself, cycling itself, and then as a result, oxygen is released as the carbon is removed from that oxygen, and then we end up breathing that in, and it sustains us. It's very symbiotic with trees, obviously, and the cycle continues. And the fungi actually keep getting these fungi, and the bacteria keep getting minerals, but these fungi particularly directly, without any middlemen, will get the sugars from the plant and take minerals out of the soil matrix and into the plant, doing that exchange. So that's how it all works. And just to show you the soil organic matter breakdown, once again, we've got live organisms biomass, dead tissue debris, and decomposed debris, which becomes humus. So these two create this, and then we can see whether the humic substances are humic in fact or non-humic. So non-humic will just accumulate in the soil as is, but humic substances can further be looked upon as insoluble human, which is highly condensed human clay complex that gets complexed in the soil, and that's if you extract it with sodium hydroxide, that's what happens. It can either go into that pool, or it can go into the humic acid, which is dark brown to black, high molecular weight humic acids, which precipitate as solids, and this is when further treatment is applied with low pH of 1 with an acid, or they become soluble in liquid, which is the fulvic acid. So lower molecular weight, that yellowing sort of substance. So once again, like these two, we must remember that the major groups of organisms that make these into humus are the fungi. So humic acids and fulvic acids are made by fungi in their cell walls, they're deposited, and that's what eventually becomes humus. It's just a lovely, lovely system that the soil is and how it functions. Just to give you a little bit of a look at what humic acid is and how complex it is, and why it is very hard to decompose it any further, and versus the fulvic acid, it's much smaller. And they contain aromatic nuclei with attached phenolic and carboxylic groups. So basically aromatic rings of carbon and hydrogen, and carboxylic groups on sides, and amino acids and hormones, and all kinds of things can be attached to these molecules holding all that in soil. They're products of fungal metabolism and sequester carbon. So soil organic matter is very important. because it has huge potential. It has huge functions, very many functions in the ecosystem of soil. And there's a great paper about the eco-functionality of organic matter in soil by Hofland et al. That you can read. That's in the references. But basically, organic matter helps water retention, so it protects from erosion. It also is absolutely necessary for primary production, water that it retains. It creates aeration because it provides soil structure and aggregation, because it allows microbes to feed on it and at the same time produce all those beautiful glues that bacteria and fungi form and make pores available in the soil and therefore retain water and oxygen. And this, of course, it feeds biodiversity because it gives them home and food. And promotion of plant happens as a result of having that organic matter in the soil. Mineralization of all the different minerals happens as well, which feeds the plants. Carbon is sequestered, of course, because organic matter is carbon, but then it gets sequestered through microbial processes that it gets broken down, and then it's retained in the soil, and that means that water quality occurs because everything stays in the soil rather than running off into waterways or being leached, and that regulates climate, of course, as we have carbon in the soil. So you can see that all of these work together and how they interact, so organic matter is key to have. It feeds microbes, first of all, so it fuels soil life, modulates microbial communities, and impacts soil processes in soil ecosystem functions. Its labile substrates, like simple sugars, for example, fuel bacteria. So things like more sugary plants that don't have much harder carbon molecules, like lots of cellulose or lignin like trees do, but rich lignin-based trunks and leaves and things like that are woody substrates that feed fungi, and because the fungi have the enzymes to decompose the lignocellulose in them. Fungi decompose old soil carbon as well, more so than bacteria, so they can acquire more nutrients from those already decomposed humic substances sometimes, because they do feed on humic substances and make them. So it's quite interesting that there's this pool in the ground, and when times are tough, organisms can actually access that and still sustain life. So if the fungal to bacterial biomass ratio is a predictive tool for enhanced carbon sequestration from this organic matter, and fungal-dominated soils sequester more carbon and retain more nitrogen. And this we'll talk about in detail in terms of the carbon sequestration lecture. So fungi to bacterial biomass ratio depends on the quality of organic inputs. High carbon to nitrogen ratio organic inputs increase fungal dominance. And I should probably just show this beautiful little diagram, just a gorgeous little representation of what the compost looks like and how that's having the bacteria in there and the fungi growing, all of that sort of feeds the plant, because these bacteria and fungi scavenge those nutrients and provide that to the plant. And this is a similar diagram where rock weathering by fungi and bacteria produces nutrients for the plant, and there's little creatures that need to be added here that will eat the fungi and bacteria and release the plant nutrients. So to access nutrients, bacteria and fungi break down rocks, gravel and pebbles into sand, silt and clay, and they have the acidic enzymes, and bacteria have the alkaline ones to deconstruct the crystalline minerals, and we've talked about this already. And also the predators and grazers absorb the nutrients from the bacteria and fungi and release excess, and that becomes plant food directly. And of course, all of this forms beautiful aggregates where the soil particles are held together tightly by glues by the bacteria and the fungal hyphae, which are these cells here, bringing to themselves and constricting the little aggregates made by bacteria into larger aggregates, creating beautiful soil structure that allows soil infiltration, oxygen, and microbial interaction surfaces. This is an example of a network of fungal hyphae here in A, holding soil particles to crop residues, and then bacterial and fungal glues bind the soil particles together into stable aggregates. So here's bacterial glues covering this residue, and the fungal hyphae then bring that all together into stable aggregate, which is a little concretion of loveliness, microbial glues, and the soil mineral particles held together. So once again, soil is a living thing. It's got all the microbes and all the creatures that feed on those microbes together with the roots and the soil mineral particles, making this beautiful structure that we call soil. And the bacteria and the fungi that are fed directly by the plant and decompose the plant debris, and the mycorrhizal fungi that live on their roots, feeding them directly, need to be obviously eaten by these protozoa and nematodes to start with that predate on the fungi and the bacteria. And this gives us our trophic levels of feeding levels of the soil food web. And every time the bacteria and fungi are consumed by the protozoa and nematodes, these release the plant available nutrients. And this is all happening around the root, by the way, because this is all microscopic and it's feeding the plant directly, automatically. And the plant actually decides which bacteria and fungi it wants to play with. And then that attracts the right predators or grazers, and that gives the right plant foods to the plant. And of course, as these little guys, they're all microscopic up to this point, feed other organisms like little arthropods, little shredders, millipedes and things, or tiny little microarthropods and larvae of insects in the soil. They also release the excess nutrients that they gained from these little guys, because remember, these are the most nutrient-dense organisms, and then anything that eats them will also be very nutrient-dense, and then this is less nutrient-dense and less and less. So it's kind of a dilution of nutrients that happens, but every time there's an excess consumed, obviously excess is released, and that feeds the plant. So our poo is very, very valuable, as is the poo of all the other organisms, obviously, and we need to be putting back into soil through our composting systems. So just to remind again that soil biodiversity supports above ground diversity in terms of how these microbes work from these very rocky situations and are transformed through the succession of microbial diversity, and then that translates to above ground biodiversity. And to summarize, we basically have covered how bedrock is transformed into soil, and how that through the decomposition, microbial decomposition and other means, sand, silt and clay is created, and how soil is really a living thing with organic matter and microbes being an essential part in calling the mineral part of soil actually soil. So that needs to be in unison and together, working, functioning together in a correct balance, and how organic matter is the most amazing substance that needs to be present and is actually generated by the plant biomass, and it comes from the roots and the photosynthetic process driving that organic matter through the roots, but also through the debris that falls to the ground from the plant whenever there's a bit of damage or a senescence of leaves. And of course, soil microbes in the soil food web, and how the microbes are the beginners of this organic matter decomposition, and then the soil food web means that these organisms, the primary decomposers, are eaten by the organisms that feed on them and then release the plant available nutrient, and that always keeps going up the food web. And so that in itself drives ecological succession. So if we want to grow particular plants, we need to understand what's happening underground and how this microbial system, whether it's in balance to actually give the right conditions for the plant that we want to grow, and for that plant to actually be able to sustain itself. Or it might be at a stage where only weeds can grow, and we can modify that system by supporting this microbial diversity and its ecological succession. So that's it. So I hope you've enjoyed the summary of what soil is, how it's formed, and what the essential components are. And in the second part of this lesson, we'll also look at how we actually degrade soil and where Australia is in terms of how we use the land and what needs to happen in order to make a shift into a healthy, restored soil ecosystem. So thanks for listening. I hope you had gained something out of this, and see you next time.